fighting our fight. And so we need to be talking about that and making sure that force is not something that dominates this world. All these issues are interconnected. You cannot have a civil society if there's not rule of law, and if you have power determine who is empowered as opposed to votes in democracy. So we'll get, we've just joined our Twitter Live, YouTube Live, and Facebook Live audiences. We're going to get on with the show. Please do help me as we go through this. And I always love your questions. I have to tell you, your questions are far better than anything I can come up with. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we'll be discussing the important topic of gun violence in our schools and the effects of gun violence on our youth and communities. We're talking to leaders who work to protect our children and prevent shootings. And our special guests today are Robyn Thomas, Executive Director of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence in California, David Mumin, co-chair of the Board of Directors at March for Our Lives in New York, Paul Murray, co-founder and chairwoman at Newtown Action Alliance in Connecticut, and Lori Alhadeff. Lori, I hope I did not mangle your last name, CEO and vice chair of the board at Make Our Schools Safe in Florida. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen will be included in our discussion. So I am going to go to you, Robyn. I'm going to give a sort of a lead in here because yesterday marked the 23rd anniversary of the Columbine high school shooting massacre, when 2 high school students murdered 12 students and a teacher, with 21 others suffering gunshot wounds. The two student perpetrators subsequently committed suicide. The largest death toll over the last 22 years of school shootings was Virginia Tech, and we'll talk about Virginia Tech. In 2007, that killed 33, and the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting that killed 28 children and adults. We will be talking about the 2018 attack, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland shooting in Florida, where 17 people were murdered and another 17 people were injured in the shooting. So just since 2020, in the last 28 months, there have been 65 school shootings at least in half of the states of the union, 65 school shootings, and 200 Americans are shot every day and injured. So that's the backdrop. That's our reality. That's where we live. We go to school, and this is what can happen. And it's not an unusual event. It's not an exception. This is every month. Robyn, could you give us, and you're on mute right now, could you give us kind of a rundown of how you see it at the Giffords Law Center? The work that Gabby and her husband Mark has done has been astounding, and the whole team there has really coalesced after that shooting in a way that has driven this dialogue. Tell us a little bit more about how you see this issue.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me, Mark. And it's really a pleasure to be here with Poe and Daud and Lori. And it's an honor to be talking with other folks who are doing this really important, difficult work this morning. You know, I think I always like to start conversations about gun violence and gun policy by saying that we do have solutions to this problem. This is a problem that has solutions. So let's start on that note of hope, that we could solve this if we had political will in this country, if there was a willingness to approach it as a public health crisis and look really at the range of preventative solutions that are available, we could make a tremendous impact. But that's not generally how it's been approached in this country. We don't have to get too much into things like the Second Amendment this morning. I know we don't have time for those debates, but there's a variety of reasons, the gun industry, the Second Amendment, and others, politics in America, why we're not doing everything that we can. At Giffords,
I would be perfectly willing to have an infinite number of guns if we ensure that no gun falls into the hands of people who go into schools and shoot up people and use guns in the commission of crimes and so on and so forth, right? So,
unfortunately, Mark, there is, as a human being, making this distinction that we know who's going to commit acts of violence versus those that we know won't is a tricky one. I mean, suicide is a huge problem. Domestic violence is a huge problem. Accidents are a huge problem. Urban gun violence, what's happening in communities of color. So, I think I hear you. And I think this idea that we could easily identify who is safe to have guns and who isn't, and that would solve the problem. Certainly that's a starting point, and I think really important. But I think we have to look more broadly at the problem and understand each aspect of gun violence and the policy solutions that are needed to address it. So without taking up too much time, I'll just say that we approach this problem through two lenses. One is the policies that work, the research-driven policies that we know make a difference, reduce gun violence, and save lives. The second is the education and politics around it. So this question of how do you get good information out there so that Americans understand what's really going on and what we need to do in order to make those things happen. There's so much misinformation. There's so much, good guy with the gun is going to save the day, kind of theory that the NRA is pushing and the gun industry is pushing to sell more guns that is really harmful. And the politics are really unfortunate because this is really a wedge political issue. And so it's leveraged in the political arena by those who want to mobilize a base or send a message, and without consideration for the negative impact it has on so many different communities. I don't think you can talk, guns in schools is a huge problem, and especially what's affecting children. And it's more than just the trauma and violence they experience when they have lockdown drills, when there are shootings in their schools. It's also when a classmate commits suicide with a gun, or when a classmate is subject to domestic violence, or when an accident happens, an unintentional shooting. So, there's like the spread of issues, and I think we approach it as a holistic issue. I think it's important to be willing to, address those nuances and look more deeply at the problem. I like seeing all the other panelists nodding. I know I'm kind of on the right track, but I do think it's important for folks to be willing to dig in at least a little bit to understand it and find hope in it.
So I'm going to go around in the order that's actually on my screen. Lori, we're going to go to you next, right? We're on track to see 40 to 45,000 deaths by guns this year, and we're on track to having, on average, 2 school shootings a month in this country. This is not a theoretical problem, is it?
Mark, it pains me so much to hear that, for you to say that, and I just want to take the opportunity at this time to remember my daughter, Alyssa Alhadeff, who was brutally murdered at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School on February 14th in 2018. And, that was my 14-year-old daughter, my only daughter, who was brutally murdered and killed. So it pains me to know that Alyssa's death and the 16 others won't be the last, and it isn't the last, and we continue to have this problem across our country. You would think that with 17 people being shot and killed in their school, that we would, as a country, come together to find a way to solve this problem, to figure out how to create safer schools. As a parent, as a mother, I sent my daughter to school on Valentine's Day, and I let her out of my car and told her I loved her, and that would be the last time that I would see Alyssa alive. So I want school safety to be a priority for our country. I want people to join the school safety movement, because I think the more that we could focus as a country to get behind making our schools safer, then we will actually help to solve and rectify this problem.
And I'm so sorry about the loss of Alyssa, and thank you for turning your energy, I don't know how you do it, to this kind of advocacy. It's a tragedy, isn't it, Daud? I mean, when you're younger than I am, and you're closer to the issue. I grew up in different places and had different versions of this, but nothing like what we're seeing now. How do you see this, Daud, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's, the work that March for Our Lives does is to remember kids like Alyssa, right? Is to remember that these lives were lost senselessly. These lives were lost because of the deliberate misaction of our federal government, as well as the sort of perpetuation by the gun industry. For March for Our Lives, where we start in this conversation is that we have failed students, right? Because students were caught in the crosshairs of inaction and bureaucracy and red tape and economic interest. And here we have parents like Lori that send their kids to school in the morning without the guarantee, without the certainty that they will get to see their kids when the bell rings for dismissal. And I think for us, that's a very harrowing reality because I grew up in Salt Lake City, and we regularly had lockdowns because there was someone within 100 feet of the school with a gun, or within 50 feet of the school with a gun, and that sort of constant reality became normal almost, right? The idea that we don't know whether or not we're going to leave school today, right? We talked very specifically with our parents growing up about these issues, right? I remember my mom would always have to somewhat warn me about these problems, and it became more normal in our communities and in our schools than so many other conversations that students should be having in the classroom became, right? And so for us, I agree with Robyn, right? We have to understand both the legislation and the policy, but also how are we doing the education culturally, politically, and socially to really help people understand this issue, right? Because with school shootings, it's not this ambiguous issue that we don't know how to solve, right? We have the research, we have the data, we have the policies, and I think that what's really harrowing is when the pandemic happened, we obviously saw a sharp decline in school shootings, but the gun violence became an even more dangerous problem because of the pandemic, and it's now in a very scary place because Congress hasn't federally acted in over 4 years on any transformational legislation, right? And I think that it's a worrisome issue because after 4 years, after we lost 17 lives at Marjory Stoneman and 17 more injured, we've lost 170,000 Americans to this issue writ large, and I think that this sort of inaction is where we are now at. It's a question of calling people out because they have names, right? They have titles. We know who these people are. And it's a question of holding their feet to the fire, because I know we're going to get into this later, because we were asked to vote, right? We were asked to show up. We were asked to activate our communities. And Robyn, Poe, Lori, and I have done that, right? We continue to do that work in our communities. And here we are. So I think it's really important to point out that these legislators have students' lives in their hands, and they're not acting to the best interest of them.
So, Poe, we just completed a poll and we said, are you worried that gun violence could occur at your local school? And over 90% said yes. And there's good cause for that concern. Talk about the view from your perspective at Newtown Action Alliance.
Thanks, Mark. Well, since my neighbor killed 20 children and 6 educators, we have been working very hard to sound the alarm that yes, if it can happen in Sandy Hook, then it can happen anywhere. I am still flabbergasted by, some responses on TV interviews after a mass shooting or a school shooting in their communities that I didn't think this would happen in my community. And I scream at the TV, it can happen anywhere now. And since the Sandy Hook tragedy, over 1 million people in America have been shot. So this is a public health emergency. It is a crisis. And it is the federal government's job, their primary responsibility to keep us safe, particularly our children. And they have failed miserably. But policies, like Robyn said, will work to prevent gun violence, and the states with strong gun laws have lower gun death rates. So we're working really hard because some states have great laws and other states do not. So right now we know, there are policies that can prevent school shootings. And one of them is Ethan's Law. It's a law to require gun owners to lock up their guns when children are in their homes, or if a prohibited person, like someone with a mental illness or with felony, are in the home. Recently, a U.S. Secret Service report showed that 76% of school shooters get their guns from their homes. And 5.4 million children are living in homes right now with unsecured guns. So yes, children all across this country are at risk for some type of violence in their schools or even in homes of their friends, their best friends.
I'd like to concentrate the discussion on some things that we can actually do. Because when you look at last year's death toll in the United States from guns, it exceeds the death toll so far in the Ukrainian war. It's a war zone, and our death toll on an annual basis has exceeded that amount, and by far. And then you add the suicide rate on there on top of that, and the injury rate. It's just astounding that that's the price that we want to pay every year. Let's take off the idea of abolishing guns and making them illegal off the table. It's not something that anyone is talking about that I know of. But we are talking about taking steps that allow people who want to make recreational use of guns just retain that right, of course. But we want to try and constrain that. So we have Ethan's Law. What other policy prescriptions, what other actions can we take? And I'm going to go back around kind of in the same way that we came in, Daud, then Lori, and then we're going to end up with you, Robyn. Daud, what other actions can we take? And the thing that I think that is interesting about March for Our Lives is that March for Our Lives is about awareness building. It's about in-your-face communication, if I get this correct, about an in-your-face problem. Let's not turn away from the problem because it just didn't happen in our community, because our community could be next. Am I getting that right, Daud?
I mean, absolutely. It's something, Poe is saying, that there's a harrowing pervasiveness to this issue, right? We don't say that gun violence is an everyday issue because we want some fancy tagline for our organizations. No, it's the real reality that gun violence is an everyday issue in everyday communities. And for us, one of the ways that we see this solution actually is the conversation at schools. I'm not sure what the consensus of the call is, but however, we've seen that, school resource officers, for example, is a conversation we need to rethink, because it's something that hasn't kept our kids historically safe in the schools, right? The shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, there was a school resource officer there that was responsibility was to protect those children. And you see that we have to think about gun violence through prevention and not only reaction, right? So how are we investing in school resource, in school nurses, school psychologists, and faculty that can really ensure that first of all, our children are going to schools that are safe, right? But then also, how can we engage with faculty and parents and community members, right, as a part of the solution to ensure that they are doing the education? Because if our kids don't know about these issues, right, they're in even more scary position, because the numbers that Poe listed off were worrisome to me for sure. And so for March for Our Lives, we really want to think about how are we doing prevention work? So right, that is a conversation about also who are we giving guns to, right? Who is not properly storing their guns? These pieces of legislation not only are low hanging, right, but they're high impact, and they
so
can.
Your aim is to build a movement. Your aim is to do movement building.
I mean, sure, but however, I think that we'd be remiss to ignore the sort of real material responsibilities that we have as an organization to advocate for funding, for resources, and for legislation and policy as well.
And Lori, what is the material thing that we need to do as a society? What should I be doing after this show? What should our governments be doing?
Well, one, I'd like to just focus on parents. I think it's important for parents to be the first line of defense, check their kids' backpacks before they go to school, because we need help. I'm also a school board member for Broward County Public Schools, and it's really important too that parents are looking at their students' social media. They know what's going on. And if they see something, say something. We are stopping violence from happening before it happens. We're stopping suicides from happening because students, parents, they are watching and they're reporting it and we're getting help for our students. Mental health, I think, is a really important aspect that also at the state level and the government at the federal level, it needs to be funded. We need to be able to reach students, connect with students, give them those wraparound services, and really help to find the fundamental underlying problems that our students are having, so we're able to prevent violence from happening before it happens. And one of the laws that we helped pass was Alyssa's law, which allows mass notification for teachers to have their own panic button. So if there is a life-threatening emergency situation on campus, whether it's a medical emergency or an active shooter situation, the teacher can push a button on their phone or a hardwire button or something they wear around their neck, like a badge, and it's directly linked to law enforcement. So we've passed Alyssa's law in New Jersey and also here in Florida. And then we have a federal bill called the Safer Schools Act, where we're trying to pass Alyssa's law as a standard level of school safety protection across the country for every school.
So this is all, we're talking a lot about response. One of the things, though, that I've noted is that if you take a look at the volume of guns in this country and new gun sales, and then you wait a beat and you see what happens, what you actually see is this northward creep of the statistics. There is a relationship between just the sheer volume of guns that are there, that are in this country, and the number of deaths and the number of injuries. How do we deal with that, Robyn? That inextricable link between the availability of guns and the context in which guns are distributed in this country, and the lack of, for example, a universal requirement that you get firearms training, or the lack of a universal requirement that there'll be a background check, lack of a universal requirement that there be a waiting period. It just seems that the whole approach right now is one in which the downstream recipients of gun violence are trying to manage that process, but we're not doing anything to ameliorate it upstream.
I think that's a really good point. I want to say two things. One is that there are specific policies that we could look to that are effective at preventing specifically things like school shootings. So we've already talked a little bit about safe storage laws, Ethan's law. There's also child access prevention laws, extreme risk protective order laws, which are laws which identify people who are in a temporary time of crisis and remove guns from them. These laws have been passed in 20 odd states since, in the last few years now. We haven't in 20 states, but a large number since the shooting at Parkland. So we call them ERPOs, risk protective order laws, minimum age laws that prevent folks under 21 years old from acquiring weapons, particularly the most dangerous weapons. So there's specific laws that we can look to and policies that are effective at this particular problem of preventing school shootings. But we track more than 50 different categories of laws. And I think you pointed out, safety training, background checks. There are countries that have high gun ownership rates and do not have the gun violence problem that we do. Canada and Switzerland and Israel, there's lots of countries that do actually have high civilian gun ownership, even Australia, which has a lot more restrictions after the shooting at Port Arthur. So looking at that comprehensive approach, California actually has a very robust model and very low gun death rates, especially when you consider guns are trafficked into California from elsewhere. So there's this really interesting correlation. We do a mapping. We grade the states every year. We look at the strength of the gun laws in each state. We sort of analyze each state, what they're doing and what they're not doing. We give them a grade, and then we look at their gun death rates. And you can go to our website and check that out. I think it's a really fascinating, informative normative place. We call it our report card, state gun law report card. And when you look at the states with strong gun laws, which very often are also states with lower gun ownership rates, there are much lower gun death rates. So, there really is a correlation. We don't use the word causation because it's sort of a complex statistical analysis, but there's a correlation between stronger gun laws and lower gun death rates. So we know that these laws work even in a country with porous borders. And I think Poe mentioned it earlier. This is a public health crisis in this country. The number of people, you said 200 a day. It's actually much higher if you include all the categories of gun violence, suicide, et cetera. So, with more than 40,000 people dying, well over 120,000 people shot every year, it's a tremendously impactful crisis on every community in America in one way or another. And a public health approach would be one where we look, as you said, Mark, at how to prevent the violence itself. And we have lots of tools for that. Yes, safety training, community violence intervention, education, safe storage. I could go on and on. As I said, we track 50 different areas of gun regulation, and we should be looking at implementing all of those across the country. And I think we'd see dramatic difference.
Well, and I think that your point that countries like Switzerland and Israel, they're not anti-gun. Everybody in Switzerland, well, everybody I know in Switzerland owns a gun, right? And they have to, their military training and so on and so forth. I think that one of the questions that I'd like to talk about now, because we are coming to the end of our time, I'm going to extend a little bit, is this question of power. Because it seems that and it's been mentioned a number of times by each of you in different ways, that we seem to be the victim of the use of this issue of guns as a meme, as a way to accumulate power, and the downstream impact is that nothing gets done, or little gets done. Action is slowed, and with this issue being used to the effect of having one party or another, or one senator or congressperson accumulating power versus another, it seems that what's happening is that we're going to use that tool for this purpose, while these death rates and injury rates are so high. Poe, how do you look at what is going on in this debate, and how do we get beyond it? How do we create the cost of using this issue as a power accumulator to be so high on all sides that it becomes radioactive? Using this issue simply to stymie, simply to take no action, that comes with a cost. How do we do that?
Well, Mark, I think it's happening already. When you just did that poll, do you think that your child will get shot? And yes, we need that secondhand smoke moment when the majority of Americans feel like they may lose their lives or their child's or their loved ones' lives. And it's getting to that point with 36% increase in gun deaths since the Sandy Hook tragedy to now. Majority of the communities and families all across the country are feeling the impact of gun violence. And most of our children are going to schools learning, to be, learning about lockdown drills, et cetera. And they're being traumatized. So most everyone is being impacted. So we need to remember that we do have the power. We have a voice, we have a vote. We need to ensure that we vote for candidates who will support sensible legislation, all the policies that Robyn mentioned. And, it's happening. We had a little setback during the Trump years because he was in the pockets of the NRA and the NSSF, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and other gun lobby groups. But we need to dismantle the stranglehold from the gun lobby, because the majority of Americans already support common sense gun laws, including background checks, red flag laws, and even assault weapons ban. So it's a small number of politicians on Capitol Hill who are not on our side. And once that flips, we're going to be able to see dramatic changes in how we deal with this issue.
We're going to go to you, Daud, Robyn, and Lori. We're going to give you the last word. Daud, how do you see this us making the use of this as a power accumulator on any side, radioactive, so that people tend towards solutions and compromise rather than being frozen in behind barricades?
I think it's the conversation with the everyday American that agrees with us, like Poe said. It's building the base of people that are demanding that their legislators on the federal and state level are doing this work, right? Because when we change people, we change policies. I think that was one of the most powerful things about March for Our Lives' work, is that we galvanized the country with over 800 marches around the world of people saying that enough is enough. And that was something that helps propel the work forward for so many organizations. And I think that's what we need to continue doing is how can we get to the people that are the most impacted? How can we get to parents and faculty and students? How can we get to, parents that have lost their children to school shootings? I think getting everyday people to really be angry about this issue is a really powerful thing, because people feel it, right? And people know that this issue, but we want people to be activated. We want people to go out. We want people to organize. We want people to do their research. God knows how many times Giffords Law Center has saved my ass. And it's really important that that we really get the everyday person mad about this issue, because Congress has had the luxury of being able to, push us off to the side, because we don't have as much power and anger on our side. And I think that it's really important that we get that base back. We get people this midterm to get really angry and to understand that this is a real issue on our hands, because we have the ideas, right? We know the solutions, we know what we need to do, and we need to get politicians on our side that are willing to be as committed and as dedicated. But that starts with us, everyday people that are angry enough to make change and to make it consistent. And it's really important that groups like this stay strong and stay together, because we're the ones that are in the faces of these people every day. It's letting them know that we need to get activated. We need to take this issue seriously. So that's what I would say in terms of building power is getting the everyday person the education they need and the action steps that they need to do something about this problem, because we need all of us.
So you're saying that our attention span, our advocacy, our vote is going to get us the country that we're going to have. And Robyn, you endorse that, right? I mean, it really does. What you're saying, what Daud's saying is we need to pay attention to this issue. We need to advocate. We need to not let it go. And you've done exactly that at the Giffords Law Center.
Yeah, our partners at Giffords spend all of their time looking for champions on this issue, the brave folks out there that are advocating for this change. They know it's going to draw heat from the other side. So one of the things we're all committed to is making sure that our champions have support, that they have votes, that they have money, that they have, the kind of messaging support that they need to be able to go out there and really take the lead in fighting for this. It's a tough issue to lead on, but I will say this: in the last couple of elections, when they do exit polls and they talk to voters about what issues are really important to them and what sits at the top of their sort of personal priorities, guns and gun violence and gun policy has moved way up. It used to not even be on the list. Now it usually comes in first, second, or third for most people, because it is something that we worry about and that touches our lives. So it has become a voting issue, but it used to be one where politicians would never talk about things like gun policy in a campaign. And now everyone's talking about it. We did a presidential forum before the last presidential election. All 10 Democratic candidates showed up to the forum to talk about their position on gun policy. That is not something that would have happened in the past. So while we're not seeing the kind of change at the federal level yet that we know we need to and we want, we are seeing a lot of change in how politicians talk about this and what they campaign on, and then who's winning. I mean, we have, Lucy McBath in Georgia in a conservative district running as a gun safety champion and winning. So things are changing. We're not quite there yet. I think we're really, really close, but we are seeing a tremendous amount of movement. This is an issue that has changed dramatically in electoral politics over the last decade. And that gives us a lot of hope. And it is because of the students at March for Our Lives who are mobilizing their generation to vote. It is the folks who unfortunately, experienced Newtown, experienced Parkland, and who, now that it's touched their lives, can't make it someone else's issue anymore. And so, with 120,000 people shot, that's the case in so many communities across the country. And it means that more and more people, sadly, sort of terribly care because it is so prevalent.
And Lori, we just finished a poll. We said, who should our legal system be able to hold responsible when a student commits a school shooting? And here's what I found to be very interesting. We gave a number of different single options: school perpetrator, the parents of the student, the school, the manufacturer. And then we gave two items that were somewhat different: any combination of these, of the perpetrator, the parents, and the school. And then we separately gave the option of everybody, including the manufacturer. 64% said it's everybody. And I'll add myself to that list. I'm responsible too. I'm responsible for the reason that Daud said. I need to advocate. I need to vote. I need to be there, be out there talking about this and becoming involved. Lori, what is your admonition to us to break this logjam? How do we do it? How do we go about this? As the voice of a parent who has lost a child, as the voice of your child, as the voice representing others who have suffered through this issue.
So I definitely think it is voting, getting out, being an informed voter. That's really important, knowing who you are actually voting for into office and knowing what they stand on all of the issues. Having a voice, being at your school board meetings, speaking up, see something, say something, and, and don't stop, because, one of the things I always continue to say is your voice is your power. And I think whether you are a student, if you're a parent, you're on the PTO, or you just have to be able to continue to be an advocate, be a voice for school safety, be a voice for change. And, we can't just wait for the next school shooting to happen before we pass major legislation. I mean, after February 14th, the families that lost that lost a loved one, we helped pass the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Act. That was the first time here in Florida where this, major legislation for gun safety was passed. But it shouldn't take such violence for these laws to happen, to change. I moved to Parkland because it was considered the safest city. And of course, we were going to send our kids to public school. So I would never have imagined Alyssa being shot 8 times in her English classroom. And so it shouldn't have to take this to happen before change to happen. So be a voice now. A lot of times we're in our own little bubbles. Get out of your bubble and make things happen now.
Such an important point. And again, I'm so sorry for the loss of Alyssa. And thank you for being that voice that we so desperately need. Robyn Thomas, Executive Director of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence in California. Daud Mumin, co-chair of the Board of Directors at March for Our Lives in New York. Poe Murray, co-founder and chairwoman at the Newtown Action Alliance in Connecticut, and Lori Alhadeff, CEO and Vice Chair of the Board at Make Our Schools Safe in Florida. Thank you so much for sharing the amazing work of your organizations, the tragedy that can be converted into change that we so desperately need. Please thank your staffs. Please thank your parents. Please thank your communities for the work that you're doing and your funders. Have a great day. Everybody stay safe. And thank you so much.